Right, hi everyone, and welcome to today's audio lecture. This is a class on the theme of white anxiety. You'll notice that I haven't actually uploaded these lectures in order. That's partly because I was really putting off doing an audio recording of this one because I really wanted to do it in person, and I was hoping that we would get a chance to have a physical class, but I think given the circumstances and how difficult a number of you are finding it to get on campus, it makes more sense to do it as an audio lecture so that you all have access to it at some point or another and no one has to worry too much. Okay, so this class is part of the theme of power. The other lecture in the power theme was the one on data and social media surveillance. What I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be talking about something quite a specific issue related to both discourse and power. So this lecture will take 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk about theoretical notions around discourse and so-called white talk. Then I'm going to discuss the theory behind the notion of moral panic. Then I'm going to talk more specifically about the case study in this instance, which is the Red October campaign. And I'm going to finish by thinking about the discursive claims that are being made by that campaign. So what I'm trying to do today is talk specifically about digital media and social media as a space of power. Right? How do digital media and social media work? In fact, do they work to replicate structures of power that are already existing? And in this case, I'm saying absolutely they exist to replicate these structures of power, because what's happening in the Red October campaign, as we'll see, is that certain type of familiar discursive formations, and in particular certain types of imagined communities that exist in digital media spaces very powerfully, are being used to replicate the power of whiteness. So we'll see the way in which discourse and social media work together very strongly. Now, it's really important that I say at the outset, and I mean this applies as equally to the conversations we've been having about gender and about sexuality and sexual identification and gender identification. And I hope that this is clear to everyone regardless, and that I don't need to say it, but I think perhaps I may do. So I want to make it very clear that I'm talking here about whiteness as a construct, right? In the same way that we talk about gender as a construct, it's incredibly important that we talk about race as a construct. Race itself is not, in inverted commas, real. There's no real biological basis for race. Right? There have been so many studies done into, for example, the supposed racial purity of Afrikaners, and historians and genealogists have proven repeatedly that the majority of people who think of themselves as Afrikaans have some sort of what we would call mixed race ancestry. So even this identity that's so strongly tied to whiteness isn't something that we could think of as being purely white. You know, this is very relevant to me and to my life as well. Because historically, in this country as well as particularly in Europe, historically Jews were not considered white. So the fact that, you know, I have this kind of very curly hair and my skin gets quite tanned in the sun, and you know, a lot of the time people in countries other than South Africa think that I'm some sort of racial mix because they're not familiar with the fact that you know, a lot of Jews look like this, suggests repeatedly the fact that my own whiteness is something that's socially constructed. However, that said, saying that race is a social construct is not the same as saying, well, we should all get over it and we shouldn't really think about it. What I'm suggesting is that it's an incredibly powerful social construct that structures the way the world we live in really, really significant ways from many different angles. And it's crucial that we are cognizant of those and, you know, take our understanding from the fact that race, regardless of its biological or scientific basis, has this huge amount of social power, social and discursive power. So, you know, I just want to reassure people who find these kind of conversations quite awkward, and, you know, this is why I'd hope to be able to talk with you guys in person about this, that critiquing whiteness as a structure, despite what Helen Ziller might say, critiquing whiteness as a structure is not the same as criticizing individual white people, right? This is not the same as saying, well, you're white, it's all your fault. What it is, and it's also not the same as saying, you know, that blackness equals one particular thing and that all black people are that way and must be that way, which obviously is something black people encounter consistently, particularly negative stereotypes around violence that accrue to black men that can be very, very distressing and upsetting. Our acknowledgement of the power of these stereotypes, the power of these ideas, and the power of these constructs doesn't mean that we think that they're true, and it doesn't mean that we think that they apply to individual people. We need to be able to talk about the social nature of race. And even as people who feel implicated in this, it can be quite difficult for us personally, we still need to be able to talk about it. So really importantly, as with gender, as with the conversations we had around, who wears what sort of clothes and plays what sort of sports and listens to what sort of music, as with claims around gender, when it comes to race, we are all complicit in shaping and defining ideas about race. So, for example, I'm sure you all know, some white women who will only date black men, or black men who will only date white women, or black women who will only date black men. We all know people who kind of ideologically racialize their love lives in this way. And whether or not we approve of this, the point is that what those people are doing is they are involved in the consistent performative re-inscribing and reconstructing of these structures of race, because they're assuming that being white means a certain thing and being black means a certain thing. Similarly, there are all sorts of people from all sorts of different racial groups who would prefer to use a white lawyer or an accountant over a black lawyer and accountant. We see this in the way that people are hired. But at the same time, there are plenty of both white people and black people who will give money to poor black people who are begging, but not to poor white people, because they assume that, white people have access to resources and have no need to be poor, whereas black people are kind of legitimately poor. So all of these things are really, really problematic, and all of these things are part of the consistent valorization of whiteness and the consistent collective constructing of race that we all do. Now, I'm making you look at these two quite unpleasant images at the moment. Normally when I give lectures, my back is to the screen, so I don't have to stare at these pictures of white people being evilly brutalized. So just so you know what you're looking at, both of these images relate to the Red October campaign, which is the case study that we'll be discussing later in this lecture about this particular issue. So let's start with the notion of white talk. Now, white talk is a phrase that I have lifted from a scholar called Melissa Stein, who some of you may be familiar with. Professor Stein is the head of the Diversity Studies Center here at Wits. She's white, she's Afrikaans. She's written very, very critically on white identity in South Africa. She wrote a book, I think, in 2001 that kind of inaugurated people speaking critically about whiteness within South African scholarship. And a lot of the work that I've done draws on her quite heavily. So, this notion of white talk that she came up with, I think, is very, very important. When we think about race as a construct, and what we need to keep in mind is that race is consistently created by discourse, right? We don't just all automatically believe that being white means X and being black means Y and being colored means another thing, and being Chinese means another thing. We acquire these beliefs by virtue of our own embeddedness in discursive structures, right? We acquire them on an everyday basis. We acquire them when we read school textbooks, when we watch TV. These types of popular media, these types of popular and unpopular media and cultural products, they teach us consistently what we are, quote unquote, supposed to think about race. So historically, if you think about the way that whiteness has been constructed, there's always been this sense, throughout the whole of modern history. It's a sense that's very, very lucky for white people and really helped with the project of European colonization, that whiteness is equated to things like intellect, civilization, progress, and modernity. Whereas blackness, in contrast, is often discursively associated with things like being uncivilized and being barbaric. And I'm sure that we're all familiar with these type of discourses. Now, I think I've probably mentioned this to you in class before, but, for example, Mahita, who you all know, has done some really interesting research about media portrayals of black South African middle class versus media portrayals of white South African middle class. And she's shown the way in which how the media talks about wealthy black people discursively suggests that there's something a bit vulgar and a bit showy and a bit over the top and a bit inappropriate about the way that they spend their money. Whereas wealthy white people, because whiteness and money are kind of discursively associated with each other, are seen to be a bit more normal, a bit less pathological. So that's just one very, very small example of how discourses produce and reproduce consistent ideas that we have about race. Now, at the moment, in the contemporary moment that we live in this country, it is not socially permissible to be a blatant racist. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily think so if you went on Twitter, but we do live in a society where it's not socially permissible to be a blatant racist, which is why the majority of anti-black racism happens either anonymously in spaces like Twitter or happens in whites-only spaces where white people speak to each other. And other white people in this class who are listening to this lecture may have had a similar experience to the one that I've had a few times, where you find yourself in all white situations, social situations, family events or, friends, parties, whatever. And you encounter other white people speaking about black people in ways that you find deeply problematic and offensive. But the assumption that's made is that because you are white, you will agree. So there's this kind of assertion of whiteness as an imagined community, of all white people being part of one thing, and that within those spaces racism somehow becomes discursively permissible. However, people generally don't refer to themselves as racist, so they'll call themselves things like patriots or liberals or realists or whatever other term is a useful way to defer the knowledge that you might be a racist. So what I'm suggesting here is that where racist speech still exists, the use of the word racist has become taboo. So it's okay, it's in some spaces, it's okay to say terrible things or imply terrible things about black South Africans. But if someone called you a racist, you'd get very angry and go, no, some of my best friends are black. So the discourse around race has changed. And a lot of this is happening in digital and social media spaces where people are collectively constructing discourses of, for example, patriotism or liberalism. Now, Melissa Steyn, who I was talking about, is very, very good on this. So she's a discourse scholar. She does similar work to the stuff that I do, where she thinks about how discourses create the world that we live in. She's interested in the media and in interviews with people. And she looks at what she calls, quote unquote, white talk. So white talk, according to Melissa, are the repertoires that white South Africans develop for making themselves feel okay about being in South Africa. So there are all these many, many different forms of white talk that white people use to defer the knowledge that perhaps they have some responsibility for historical inequity, whether we were personally responsible or not. Stories that repertoires that white people develop to make themselves feel okay about the fact that the majority of black people in this country are still poor. Versions of ways of speech that white people develop to tell themselves that it's okay for us to still have the social and economic power that we have, even though we don't have political power. Or, in the case I'm interested in, repertoires of speech. White talk as a form of a repertoire, a discursive repertoire that allows white people to claim victim status in South Africa, to assume that it's other people are now victimizing us. This narrative of reverse racism that exists very, very powerfully online. So if we were in the same room, I would ask you guys whether you have any ideas about forms of white talk. And this is something that we have discussed in class before. One word that comes up a lot in white South African discussions about black South Africans, and that's particularly relevant to the current moment of Fees Must Fall, is the word entitlement. So white people will say about black people, you will just have a sense of entitlement, you think you should get free education. I was a waitress, I worked throughout my degree, why don't you work, why are you so lazy? And of course, historically, laziness is also something that's discursively attached to black people. And of course, the counter to that is that it's easier to work your way through university when, firstly, you're white and it's easier to get a waitressing job. Secondly, you have parents who can help you if you end up in a really, really bad financial situation, or you can live with your parents. You probably have, maybe you have a car, even if you've paid for it yourself. You grew up in a house that had a lot of books in it. English is your first language. So actually, on balance, university is probably easier for you than it is for a lot of your peers, which means you have more time to go out and get this mythical waitressing job. And the fact that you live at home, even though it's not ideal, still means that you probably eat better than people who are on NSFAS grants and have very, very little money for food and come to school hungry, or people who aren't on grants at all. So all of these things are ways of countering, all of these facts are ways of countering this discursive construction of whites as hardworking and black South Africans as kind of lazy and entitled. And these discourses are things that we all slip into very, very easily. And of course, this isn't restricted to white South Africans. Black South Africans slip into discursive constructions of race all the time and of whiteness. We all do it. But that is not what we're interested in today, because what we're talking about today is specifically how discourses that appear on social media exist to further the privileging of whiteness and to entrench a sense of whiteness as somehow exceptional, special, different, and deserving, generally deserving of better than blackness. Okay, so the next few slides that I want to look at come from a campaign that came out last year called I am Stellenbosch. And it was a campaign launched by largely white students of Stellenbosch University to counter the narratives that were coming out of Fees Must Fall, which those white students thought were very divisive. And they were calling Fees Must Fall a racist movement because it was critical of white privilege and white power. So there's quite a few of these. Now, I don't mean to shame these people individually. What I'm interested in is thinking about the discourses that they are attached to. So this girl's saying, I'm white and I would love to learn an African language, right? That's great. It's a really nice thing to say. And of course, it's a really important thing to do. But discursively, what is it doing? It's basically laying a claim to Africanness, right? It's going, well, I may be white, but I'd be very happy to learn something of Africa because I think of myself as an African. Which, of course, anyone who's familiar with debates around who gets to call themselves African will realize is actually, in its own way, quite problematic. This student is going, I'm white and I feel guilty, which is also comes with its own set of problems, right? Like my mum used to tell me when I was a teenager, guilt is a wasted emotion. Guilt also has a discursive role, right? Guilt as a discourse also does something in terms of whiteness, right? Guilt is not an action. Guilt is not reparation. Guilt is not working towards social justice. Guilt is just going, I feel bad. So in a way, discursively, what guilt does is it recenters the I, right? It allows you to put yourself back in the middle. Instead of asking, what can I do? It's about you going, this is how I feel. And of course, white South Africans have the right to talk about how they feel just as much as everyone else does. But in this context, the reason that it's interesting is that it's been used to counter the perceived reverse racism of Fees Must Fall. So discursively, what's going on here is the suggestion that Fees Must Fall is racist, but that's not fair because, we white people, we already feel guilty. Here what's going on is that this young man is trying to counter, he's trying to counter kind of stereotypes about people's cultural consumption and saying, because he listens to rap music, he's not a stereotypical white guy. Now, some might say that this is just an act of cultural appropriation, that it's not enough to just listen to the music of a different group or a different culture and adopt that as something you like if you're not willing to take on the struggles of that culture, which of course is, the critique that got leveled at Miley Cyrus by, I think it was Nicki Minaj, when, she was doing an awful lot of twerking. So again, this is not a question of being critical of this one individual because he likes rap music. It's rather, what is the discourse that he's playing into here? The discourse that he's playing into here is that, well, race is more complicated than this and it's not okay to be racist because we all like different things and sometimes I like stuff that, is imagined to be something that black people like. And of course, that's completely true. But that doesn't change structural injustices, right? If you are a student on Wits campus at the moment, you're a black South African student on Wits campus at the moment, and you like things that only your white friends like. You don't like anything that your black friends like, but everything you like is stuff your white friends like. That won't stop you being the one out of a whole group of students. If you're walking along with your white friends, you might still be the one who gets searched by the private security when you're trying to come into the Great Hall. So the point I'm trying to make there is that the ways in which we consume popular culture don't have any influence on structural injustice. So claiming that they do is a discursive move that suggests that race, quote unquote, doesn't matter. Here again, we see this very old, recognizable discursive turn, which is pretty much the equivalent of going, well, some of my best friends are black, which I'm sure some of you have encountered. It's the same thing where people go, well, I'm not homophobic because I have a gay friend, or I'm not a misogynist because some of my friends are women. It doesn't, that doesn't work, again, because that doesn't work as a real life way of being, because who you are friends with, again, doesn't have any impact on structural issues of injustice. So while these statements may be as valid as they need to be on a personal level for these individual people, once we start thinking about how they work as discourses, we see that they repeat familiar and recognizable discourses around race that are very, very common and that are a form of what Melissa Stein calls white talk, the types of discourses that white people use to make themselves feel more comfortable about living in such a complex and racially charged environment. And in this one, this girl is going, I'm a white Afrikaans girl, but I don't see color. And this, for me, is one of the most significant and important claims that can be made within these discourses of white talk, right? I don't see color. And of course, it's not only white people who make these claims. Colored people make them, black people make them, other people, all sorts of people make these claims all the time saying, I don't see color. But the reason that this is so inordinately complex is, to go back to our question of who's getting their bags searched by security at the front of the Great Hall. It's all very well for you to not see color, but other people looking at you will still see your color. It is only white people who have the luxury of not seeing color. Because white people are not racially profiled by police, by security, by the state, by other people who live in areas where we live who don't look at us and assume we're criminals, we don't understand what it means to inhabit race in a really significant, endless way. There's another very good scholar, a guy called Richard Dyer, D-Y-E-R, who wrote a book called White. And in his book, he shows how one of the ways in which whiteness manifests and replicates itself is by suggesting that it's just kind of normal. It's not really a race, it just is. If you're white, you just are. And if you're any other color, then you have a color. So the way that this relates to that is that the idea that you cannot see color is an idea that comes along with the idea that you don't really have a color. So it's easy enough for you to not notice what race anybody else is. But it's not easy for other people to not have that noticed, because if you walk into a shop and the security guard looks at you because he thinks you might steal something, or you walk into a job interview and you're worried about your accent, you don't have the luxury of going, well, I just don't see color. So it's a very, very powerful discursive move that also actually, not only does it help to create a sense of the self as kind of post-racial, it also helps to defer the potential discomfort that a white person might need to feel about the way that privilege manifests in everyday life. Now, as suggested in the Joseph Wambungu reading that I gave you, claiming victim status is one major way that many white people in South Africa deal with the complexity of living in a democracy. So the Red October campaign that we're going to look at in a minute is a really fantastic example of how this works, this claim of victimhood. So what we're doing when we look at this claim of victimhood is we're looking at that as one of numerous discursive constructions of whiteness, like the ones we've just seen. Some of my best friends are black, but I already feel guilty. I don't see color. I like rap music, whatever else it might be. I'm a victim of reverse racism is a far more right-wing, but still similar iteration of the same thing. So at this point, I'd like you to stop and go and watch a video. This is a video about poor white South Africans blaming reverse racism. You can watch it by copying and pasting this link, or you can download it directly from your Sakai portal. So hopefully, having watched the video, you'll get a stronger sense of what I mean about the narrative of victimization, right? That what's going on here is this idea that of reverse racism of whites as victims that's just been shifted. Just like black people used to be poor and troubled by the government, and now white people are poor and troubled by the government. And it's that simple. So let's think about that in terms of the so-called sense of entitlement that's often brought up, right? If we're going to claim that black South Africans have a sense of entitlement, then we also need to think very, very carefully about the idea that somehow it's not normal or appropriate or okay for white people to be poor. Because what's going on there is indeed a really strong sense of entitlement. This idea that poverty and whiteness just don't go together, that white people are entitled to a better life by virtue of nothing other than being white. Okay, so let's move on to point 2 in this lecture, which is moral panic. Now, hopefully some of you will have encountered the idea of moral panic before. So I'm going to read you a section from a book called Folk Demons and Moral Panics by a sociologist called Stanley Cohen. And this was kind of, ground zero of moral panic research. He wrote this great book, and everyone who ever talks about moral panics, including me, quotes this section from it. So let me read it to you. Cohen says that societies appear to be subject every now and then to periods of moral panic. A condition, episode, a person or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. Its nature is presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media. The moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians, and other right-thinking people. Socially accredited experts pronounce their diagnoses and solutions. Ways of coping are evolved or more often resorted to. The condition then disappears, submerges, or deteriorates and becomes more visible. Sometimes the object of the panic is quite novel, and at other times it's something which has been in existence long enough but suddenly appears in the limelight. Sometimes the panic passes over and is forgotten except in folklore and collective memory. At other times it has a more serious and long-lasting repercussion and might produce changes such as those in legal and social policy, even in the way the society conceives itself. So that's Stanley Cohen talking about what a moral panic is and what it does. Now, we don't need to think about this in too much detail at the moment, but the reason I'm giving you this is that I want to suggest that the Red October campaign that we'll be talking about in a minute was in fact an attempt by elites to construct a moral panic. Now, after Stanley Cohen wrote his book, a lot of other people have been writing about moral panics. I mean, this book is old, it's from the 70s. Stuart Hall wrote a book with a number of other researchers about mugging in London in the 80s, and that was a major change to moral panic research because he talked specifically about how moral panics relate to hegemony. So Hall and his co-writers talked about moral panics serving a purpose to entrench certain types of existing power. Now, there have been many, many alterations to this theory and improvements to this theory over the years. This is one of the things that I'm working on at the moment, is a way of trying to rethink how we perceive moral panic from a global South perspective. But moral panic, as Stanley Cohen and Stuart Hall imagined it, is still really useful for looking at social formations. One of the reasons that it's really useful is the idea of, for example, moral entrepreneurs. So moral entrepreneurs are people who get involved in these moral panics and foster them and make them more familiar and make them more important. And, these are often editors of newspapers or people who work for the police or journalists or priests or parents, people who have some degree of social power, who take on the moral panic and make it get more hysterical and make it get more attention. So questions that we could ask then would be, what are some examples of moral panic that we are familiar with? A lot of my research has been around moral panics about Satanism and what it means when people in South Africa suddenly out of the blue start panicking about Satanists, because this happens periodically. Another example of a moral panic is panic around pedophiles. which happens frequently, these pedophile panics pop up. In earlier days than now, there used to be moral panics around homosexuality, when gay people were imagined to be criminal, were imagined to be pedophiles. So these sorts of cultural formations where something becomes a folk devil and societies become collectively hysterical about them and moral entrepreneurs become involved and publicize the moral panic. These things are very, very common, and they're very interesting, and they work in many multitudinous ways. So let's move on to Red October. Red October is what I'm calling an elite attempt to construct a moral panic, specifically using social and digital media spaces. Spaces in which powerful discourses of white talk are, as we've seen, already existent and already very familiar. So the Red October campaign was started by two Afrikaans musicians, Steve Hofmeyer and Sunette Bridges. And it was aimed at raising awareness about the so-called white genocide that was happening in South Africa. The campaign was centered around the 10th of October 2014, during which they wanted to have a so-called global event. So balloons would be released near Parliament in South Africa and also in the US, the UK and Australia, which of course are three countries that have large communities of expatriate white South Africans who've moved to those places. So what Red October is doing is it's claiming that there actually is a genocide of white people in South Africa, and it's linking this very closely to farm murders. And of course we all know that farm murders exist, they happen in South Africa, that they're a huge, huge, huge problem. And that, these are terrible events that we as a society should not be standing by and letting them happen. What Red October does is it racializes farm murders. It turns them into an intentional, genocidal, wiping out attack on whites. And this is really complex because what it does is it actually ignores the presence of any non-white people who are killed in farm murders. And of course, plenty of non-white people are killed in farm murders because the majority of people who work on farms are not white. There are many, many deaths in these sorts of events, and a lot of those who die are workers, but they don't exist in Red October's understanding of farm murders. So that's the one thing that the campaign does. The other thing that the campaign does is divorce farm murders from other types of violence in South Africa. So even though statistically and proportionally, white South Africans experience less violent crime than poor black South Africans, people who live in poor rural areas and townships, without a doubt, are at the highest risk of experiencing violent crime. Red October suggests that violent crimes perpetrated against white people are somehow separate from and different to other violent crimes that take place in this country. So in this way, what they do is they suggest that crimes perpetrated against white people are somehow exceptional, that white deaths are somehow exceptional, that white deaths must be thought of separately from the scourge of South African deaths. So rather than becoming involved in the fight against crime in general, they're saying crime against white people is somehow special and different and needs to be treated differently, and because it's crime against white people, it's a genocide rather than it just being crime. So here are some quotes from the Red October website, which you can go and have a look at if you're interested in. They say, "No longer will we be silent about the oppression of our people. No longer will we endure the killing of our people on our farms and in our towns and cities. We can no longer be silent about the brutal torture of the elderly and the defenseless. We are tired of corrupt governance, racist black economic empowerment, and affirmative action policies. We can no longer tolerate the destruction of our infrastructure, our filthy government hospitals, our pathetic educational system, dirty dams and rivers, uninhabitable parks and public areas, dangerous neighborhoods, and filthy streets. The list is endless, and we say it's enough." So let's think for a minute of what's going on there, right? It's not only white people who get killed on farms and in towns and cities. It's not only elderly and defenseless white people who are hurt. It's not only white people who suffer because of the destruction of infrastructure, bad hospitals, bad education, dirty dams and parks and public areas, and dangerous streets, right? All South Africans suffer when those things don't work. The only thing, that whole litany of ills, that actually relates solely to white people is black economic empowerment and affirmative action policies. And by calling these policies racist, what the Red October campaign is doing is de facto flipping the discourse into a discourse of reverse racism. It's saying that attempts to equalize past injustice are racist. And of course, what is this but a denial of history, right? What this discourse of reverse racism does is suggest that when the ANC took over in 1994, history became irrelevant and nothing that went before, and all of the very, very well-designed, carefully planned structures of inequality suddenly weren't there and didn't matter. And of course, these structures of inequality go back way before 1948, when the apartheid state actually took power. They go back to the very dawn of the colonial era in this country and on this continent. But the claim of reverse racism insists that 1994 made everybody equal, just like that, that all of the, hundreds of years of history just vanished in one fell swoop. So what the website then goes on to say is people all over the world will gather bearing red balloons and white crosses in memory of those who have lost their lives and in protest against the inhumane slaughter and oppression of white South Africans. So you can hear how dramatic this language is, right? And how specific it is, and how it attempts to claim, an attempt to construct a moral panic. It attempts to claim that white South Africans particularly are being targeted for particularly brutal elimination. And of course, if we look at the facts, it's quite clear that that's not the case. But nonetheless, what the Red October campaign was designed to do was to use social media to drum up support for these beliefs and these arguments. So this slide is an image of some of the marches that took place around the world in support of the Red October campaign. On the right, you can see this woman holding a sign. You can see some of the stuff that she's written. It's very interesting, right? She's in London. She said things like, the goal of the people perpetrating this white genocide is to establish communist tyranny. Now, where does this idea of communism come from? This is something that's so familiar to people who are older than you guys, who grew up during apartheid, right? We were constantly told to be afraid of communists. Communism has no sway in Southern Africa in any meaningful way anymore. And yet, these older ideas about communism still underlie a lot of the hysteria that white people drum up when they're attempting to claim victimization. You can see what's going on here, right? The top picture has a picture of an old South African flag. So this is not just a protest about a so-called white genocide. This is something about taking back white power. Very interestingly, that in a protest of this nature in London, that there will be black people involved. Right at the bottom of the screen, the image on the right at the bottom is an American white supremacist group. So they're holding signs saying white pride worldwide. And of course, this is not how the white genocide people are talking about themselves. This is not how they're describing themselves as part of this white pride movement. They're describing themselves as a group that supports the rights of minorities. But yet, these are the people that they're appealing to. So there's something very, very useful here about the way in which social media spaces allow the formation of different groups that ally each other with each other, right? So because the Red October campaign existed largely online, other than these few marches, and you can see that these marches aren't very large, because the campaign existed largely online, it became for a brief period of time a rallying call for white supremacist groups around the world who were going, we've got to stop the genocide of white farmers, we've got to stop this racist murder of white farmers, this genocide for which there is absolutely no proof. And next to that, also really interestingly, and I believe that image is also from a march that happened in the UK, is a white person holding a sign that says White Lives Matter, which for anyone who's familiar with the Black Lives Matter campaign will be hugely problematic. Because of course the whole point of the Black Lives Matter campaign is to suggest that the rate at which black people are killed in the US is disproportionate, killed by police, is disproportionate and unfair and suggests that black lives don't matter. And that's not the case. It's not the case in South Africa in the same way that white lives don't matter, because, as I've said, white people experience proportionately less violent crime than black South Africans do. But nonetheless, as these images show, the Red October campaign did have some currency. It did work around the world. Most of the people who got involved and came to these marches were originally South African, but as in the American example, and also with some people who got involved in Australia, some of them were just white supremacist groups from other countries who jumped on any opportunity to, attempt to discursively reclaim white privilege and white power by claiming victim status. So the act of discursively constructing oneself as a victim can also actually be a way of reinscribing the power of certain iterations of race. Okay, so now I want you to pause and go and watch a video about the Red October campaign, which you can find either by following this link or again on your Sakai portal. Okay, so now that you've watched that, hopefully you'll be able to see some more of what I'm talking about, the way in which the claim of white victimhood and white genocide actually just exists in these cases as a thinly disguised veil for blatant racism, right, and blatant attempts to re-achieve white privilege and white dominance. So there are a lot of confusing and mixed messages going on within Red October. The marches focused on farm murders, but websites and other media around it talk about general crime trends in South Africa. So there's this kind of, there are many, many different things that the campaign is trying to do. And, as you saw with those images of the people who came to the march, in some cases those messages didn't get through at all because people were just coming out with absolute unfettered racism instead of the kind of post-racial racism that uses discourses of white talk to claim that white people are minorities and need to be protected in South Africa. So to move on to stage 4 of this lecture, let's think about the discursive message of the online Red October campaign. Red October was an attempt by elites to construct a moral panic that would have served certain hegemonic interests. It was an attempt to harness and reuse a media discourse around rights and minorities, but it was also largely a failure because most people in South Africa just didn't respond to it. There were a lot of people laughed at it, a lot of people teased it. The press response was mostly critical and quite mocking. So this elite attempt to create a moral panic around an alleged white genocide of white people didn't actually work at all, right? It only preached to the converted. The only people who got involved were people who already believe this sort of stuff and people who are already the sorts of people who follow someone like Steve Hofmeyr. The article that I gave you in your reader by Wilhelmine Kalitz, actually it's not an article, it's a section from her master's dissertation. It's an analysis of a speech that Steve Hofmeyr gave at a Red October rally, and it also shows really efficiently the different discourses at play in the live action version of Red October. So white people as victims of unfair policies, like black economic empowerment, white people as the most important element in making South Africa great, that, without white people arriving when they did, this country wouldn't be what it is, it would be nothing. And then lastly, the idea of white people rejected from the South African polis, so white people now needing to claim their South Africanness. So the debates that are happening here are not only about, white people apparently as victims, or about where white people fit into South Africa, but also about what it means to be from this country. So the Red October campaign is locked into a whole series of different discourses, one of which is about South Africans, white South Africans, being allowed to claim South Africanness, which of course is one of the big arguments that goes on consistently in this conversation. Who is African, right? And who gets to call themselves African? So as Joseph Wambungu suggests, the way that this works is that Red October uses a reversal strategy. It uses a reversal strategy by making government out to be the quote-unquote real racists, the ones who are punishing and torturing white people and ignoring the genocide that they're undergoing and doing all these terrible things to them. So if the government is the real racist, then these very conservative far-right groups are not real racists, because of course, as we've seen from the type of discourses that accrue to this stuff, they made South Africa great and they have a lot of black friends. So this is a fantastic example of the way that discourse is used in the service of power. Even though it failed because it didn't get the press response it would have liked to have gotten, and it was largely not taken seriously by people who were not its primary constituency, it still shows us how discursive rhetorical formations of white talk actually try to reinscribe the power of whiteness. This is taken from the website of Red October, and it's very, very interesting if we think about the semiotic representation of whiteness that's going on here, right? So let's think of all the things that are going on visually and in terms of words on this page. Who's being quoted here? The UN Commissioner for Human Rights, and Jacob Zuma, and Martin Luther King. So these are all people that one would imagine were not the natural go-to people for a very, very far-right, fundamentally racist white group. But what's going on here is that Red October is attempting to insert itself into an existing discourse of minorities and human rights. It's claiming minority status for white people, even though we know historically that the idea of minorities was developed to support people who are actually distressed and downtrodden minorities. For example, transgender people or African Americans in the US, people whose minority status actually properly leads them to having major problems with social justice. Minorities are not just about numerical minorities. And white South Africans statistically still have a lot more money and a lot better lifestyles and higher educational level than most black South Africans. So the fact that we are in a minority doesn't necessarily make us a minority in the sense in which the discourse intends it. However, what Red October does very clearly here is it tries to adopt that discourse to support its cause of emphasizing reverse racism. So it does that not only by quoting these three different people, it also does it, you can see at the bottom, the way that image is set up. The image is so interesting, right? It's the kind of image that will be familiar to us from, say, pamphlets on adoption or, really, really progressive media texts that show lots and lots of different kind of people of different ages and statuses and types and classes. It's just in this instance, every single one of those people is white. So visually, we are getting a recognizable and familiar play on a very particular discourse of minorities and of modernity and of diversity. But actually, what's happening is everyone within that is white. So what the website does is it discursively and semiotically attempts to claim control over a discourse of minorities, human rights, and modernity in order to shore up and strengthen its claims about what is happening allegedly to white people. These are a number of tweets that came out at around the time that the campaign was first being put together in 2013, that started hashtagging stories about attacks on white people with the hashtag Red October. But in this you can see very, very clearly the way in which the rights discourse and the quite attemptedly progressive narrative that exists in the Red October website kind of stumbles a bit when people start tweeting about it, because they're saying things like black savages and libs scream racism and evil knows no bounds and ANC regime's genocidal behavior, right? So what's going on there is, whereas the website is suggesting that we need to counter this white genocide because we believe in human rights and minority rights, what individual people tweeting are doing is they're going, well, no, actually, that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is blatant, evil, black, savage racism. And then, this is one of my favorite things. And then in some of the responses to the tweets were very, very critical. What I've given you on top is a tweet that Steve Hofmeyr actually sent about me after I wrote a critical article about the Red October campaign in the Daily Maverick. And below is an amusing meme that someone made saying "fly little symbols of racism fly" about the red balloons that Red October had asked people to let go of as part of the campaign when it happened in 2014. So what you can see is you can see a number of differing discursive positions that are being developed. You can see the one that's developed specifically by Red October itself, which is making certain claims about rights and about minorities and about genocide and about the state's obligations to its citizens. You can see other claims being made by people who are involved on Twitter, where they are making much more blatantly racist claims. And then you can see reverse discourses in this final image here, where the claims of racism are thrown back onto the Red October campaign. And I think, this is why the campaign didn't work, because it is very, very blatantly obvious to anyone looking at it that it cannot legitimately claim that the state is racist when it is so clearly embedded in all of these racist narratives, despite the fact that it's trying to hide them under more allegedly progressive discourses by using words and imagery and quotations that seem very familiar to people who have grown up in an age of allegedly post-racist discourse. So then the final thing that I want you to watch, again, you can follow the link or you can go and get this out of your Sakai folder, is this video, which is a satirical take on the so-called white genocide. Whether you think it's funny or not, I guess, is up to you. But what I think it does very well is it amusingly undercuts the very excesses, the over-the-topness of the claim of genocide. So it undermines the discursive claims of the entire Red October campaign by using satire and mockery, which of course are rhetorical strategies that you guys will be familiar with from throughout your media studies degrees. So that's the last thing I'd like you to do. Go and have a look at this video, and then I want you to think overall, kind of going on from this lecture. What I want you to take away from this is an understanding of how this campaign, as a case study of the interrelation between power and discourse, this campaign shows how attempts to claim power can exist within the social media space, and they can have different consequences and different effects. In some ways they can seem successful because, of course you have people as far afield as Australia and America jumping onto this campaign. In other ways they can seem like a complete failure because South Africans in general treated this campaign with the scorn that I think it deserved. But what's fundamentally important is that the free space of the internet, the free space of digital media, allowed Steve Hofmeyr and Sunette Bridges to create this campaign and allowed this campaign to step out of people's phones and computers and onto the streets in the form of actual protests. So whether or not Red October helped to strengthen an already existing notion of white superiority and white power, which I don't necessarily think it did, it was without question a very powerful attempt to use discourse and to use moral panic in order to re-cement the power of the racial construct of whiteness. That is it for this lecture. Thanks, guys.